Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this conference and to discuss this paper. Um, so the paper sets out to study the role of natural capital in a growth model. It shows that it's optimal to use natural capital provided that the initial stock is sufficiently abundant and the existence of a tipping point typically reduces the optimal exploitation. Under some circumstances, it's optimal to subsidize the conservation of natural resources. So it's certainly an ambitious paper. It attacks a problem that everybody, at least everybody in this conference, would recognize as being important, and it's also very challenging. I think the most effective integrated assessment models in the climate setting are those that have something to say about the magnitude of something that's interesting to us. For example, the social cost of carbon, or the way in which some type of uncertainty or ambiguity or discounting might affect the magnitude of this variable. And this paper it really makes a great attempt to calibrate the model, but in its current state, I don't think that the qualitative results are directly usable for guiding policy. And I don't really mean that as a criticism. This is an ambitious paper, and I think it provides a platform for thinking about natural capital in a growth setting, and I expect more to come out of it in the future. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the aspects of the model that struck me. It has two regions. Home has a stock of natural capital and F doesn't, and home uses both green and brown natural capital and labor to produce these two types of intermediate goods, and the two intermediate goods aggregate to a single intermediate good. And total natural capital is the sum of perfectly fungible green and brown natural capital. This aspect of the modeling surprised me a little bit. Green natural capital is a stock, but brown natural capital, it's actually a flow. And that just means that any brown capital that's used in a period vanishes. As I read the paper, I thought it helpful to think about the fishery context. And actually, this paper lines up pretty directly with a standard fishery model. You can think of the fish stock as being the green national capital, and the fish harvest is the brown national capital. So you can take fish out of the stock and use it up, and that's like using brown national capital. Now, both regions produce a final good using non-traded labor and capital and the intermediate good, and these goods are traded. So in some respects, this paper is part of a much larger tradition because, of course, just about every integrated assessment model used in the climate setting does use natural capital. So this paper is different because it focuses on different aspects of natural capital. It's not the natural capital per se that's distinctive, but the precise way in which it's modeled. And there are two models of the evolution of natural capital. And again, I think that the fishing analogy is pretty useful. At least it helped me understand it. The first model uses what's in the fishery literature is known as a logistic growth model. And this is parameterized using just two parameters, a carrying capacity and a natural growth rate. And the natural growth rate is the approximate growth rate for small stocks. And the second model uses what's known in the fishing literature as critical depensation, in which growth is negative for stocks below a critical level. The I think that it would actually be useful for at least for readers coming from resource economics, not so much from the macro side, but for resource economics to draw out this connection with the fishing literature. Now, one of the features of the model with critical depensation, what the paper refers to as a tipping point, is that the model it's non-convex. So the growth equation is convex over some region and it's concave over another region. And in this respect, it's a special sort of an extreme case of what's referred to as the shallow lake problem. And in these sorts of problems, there's a unstable steady state that lies between two stable steady states. And in some of these problems, there's a skiba point, which is just some level of the stock such that if you begin above that level, you move toward one steady state, and if you begin below it, you move to another steady state. And these problems are kind of complicated because the skiba point does not coincide with the unstable steady state. So it's not always straightforward to identify the skiba point. And the reason I bring this up is because the paper doesn't talk about these aspects at all. But I wondered whether the non-convexity created any issues with the numerical solution. And just sort of more generally, it might have been more natural to have started with a model that more closely resembles the shallow lake setting rather than the critical depensation setting, because the critical depensation that's the case where the growth is zero when the stock falls below a certain point. That's, as I say, kind of an extreme situation. I was puzzled by the role of uncertainty in this model. So we're told early on that the growth rate of natural capital is subject to a multiplicative shock, and you see expectations operators both in the statement of the problem and in the first order condition. So in this case, of course, because this is an AR1 process, the lag state variable is a state variable, or rather the lag shock is a state variable. And I was curious how the problem is solved, and the only hint that I could see was a reference to two papers. And at least one of these papers I know uses dynamic programming. So I assumed that that's what this paper was doing. But then I couldn't understand how to interpret the trajectories these are shown in section 4.3, but there are also lots of examples of them in the slides that we just saw. I mean, the problem, of course, is that when you have a stochastic problem, you don't know what you don't know what the stock is going to be in the future. You can graph the expectation of the stock or something else. And I'm not exactly sure how to interpret these. Now, at some point in the talk, we were told that the random variables were, or the realizations of the random variables were set to zero, their expected value. And perhaps that's what it's doing, but then I don't really know what the role of uncertainty in the model is. And so I think that's something that it'd be interesting to describe more thoroughly. One of the reasons why this seems important to me is that when you have uncertainty in critical depensation, then I ask what prevents all trajectories from leading to resource exhaustion. It just seems that you could have a succession of really unfortunate shocks that would cause the stock to fall below the critical level. And over time, the probability of getting such a succession of bad shocks seems very high. So I just found that part of the paper unclear, but that might have been the fault of the reader, me. So when I when I began the paper, I thought that the emphasis was going to be on the externality, and the motivating examples certainly do involve a very important externality. I mean, the paper talks about the loss of biodiversity. That's, I think, the example that would occur to most of us immediately, and that's obviously an externality. The paper begins by using World Bank statistics to calibrate natural capital, and I wondered whether these statistics involve resources for which there are actual prices. I think that that's the case, but again, I'm not sure. But my point is that I think that the reason that we really care about the role of natural capital in this sort of setting is because the property rights are so weak, and because the externality is really the most salient, or one of the most salient features of the problem. Much of the paper deals with the situation where the competitive equilibrium is optimal, and so there's no role for policy. Towards the end of the paper, the authors introduce the externality, and the presentation we just saw described how that occurs through TFP. And here, of course, there is a role for policy. I would suggest de-emphasizing the case of perfect property rights, because that's not why we're interested in this problem, I think. But certainly the problem with missing property rights is very important, and introducing the market failure through TFP is pretty much the standard way of doing things in this setting. So I just have a few minor points that I'll conclude with. Most of these are just comments to the authors that might help in making things clear. I guess the only thing the only point that I'll talk about is that Frances Moore and her co-authors they have some papers that introduce non-standard types of natural capital into climate-related integrated assessment models. I think that those papers, her work and her co-authors' work, might be relevant because of the way that she does think about natural capital in a manner that's not completely standard. So I think my 10 minutes are up, maybe even more than 10 minutes. So I apologize if I went over time, but I'll conclude here.
Thank you, Larry, and you were within the time allocated, so no problem on that front. Any questions from the audience? We have a few minutes. Okay, so I guess we can come back to Luigi.
Yes. So thanks a lot for the comments. They're all very insightful. I think they'll help improve the paper. So for the solution of the model, what we are doing is assuming that the shocks are small. They might amplify the regeneration, the accumulation rate, or slightly reduce the accumulation rate, and we are doing that with a kind of a quadrature approximation. And so when we solve the algorithm, we are never tipping to the scenario where you'd fall into the negative accumulation rate. So this is perhaps a bit of a shortcut. But that's the best way we thought about having both the accumulation rate of nature allowing for a critical threshold, and also at the same time some kind of uncertainty. And the idea is that essentially here all the simulations are generated such that, as you mentioned, the shocks are zero, and so the parameter or the exogenous variable z, which is multiplied to the accumulation rate, is equal to 1. And so there is, even though the agents are incorporating as an expectation that the accumulation rate tomorrow might be higher or lower than today, in practice, when we simulate the model, there is no such effects happening. And in terms of property right, I agree. It's a very important aspect. Even though there are throughout the world there are social arrangements where natural capital is well managed, even though there are no clear or standard property rights set in place. There might be simply social norms and other systems of managing resources in a collective way. So, I mean, so it's not as stark as it might seem initially, and also part of the idea of having these shocks to the accumulation rate was also to have a specification where these shocks, while not having a predefined narrative, they could reflect also to some extent the fact that in some countries you may have more uncertainty regarding how much nature you will end up tomorrow, because perhaps there are some poachers, which of course we're not modeling, but there might be some actions that happen and that might make your stock of nature less abundant tomorrow. So I think these were the main points raised by Professor Karp. So yeah, I'll end up here.